Dear brothers, good morning, boys. Happy Wednesday. Halfway through the week. Got a hurricane bearing down here on the western coast of Florida. Where we live is really not going to get a whole lot. But naturally, the weather people and lots of other folks are going to lose their minds about it, which in some cases is warranted. In other cases, not quite so much. So if you live down here, don't be a jerk at the gas stations or the grocery stores. Be nice. Start with that. All right, listen. Figure this would be a good morning to talk a little bit about something that pretty much every man that I work with has discussed with them. If it becomes a problem, or even in the beginning when we're doing initial testing, physical testing, blood tests, etc., of some things that we look at very stringently, that if they are awry, we need to adjust immediately. Okay? So essentially what this is labeled under is what we call metabolic syndrome. And so metabolic syndrome is essentially that you have metabolic dysfunction in some capacity. And so it basically gives us an idea of how healthy or unhealthy you are. The more metabolic dysfunction you have, the higher your risk of cardiovascular disease, strokes, Alzheimer's, etc. And so there are 5 categories that we look at that all men need to know about themselves, that they need to be checking consistently. Some of them more than others, which I'll explain. And then it just needs to be something that is very transparent to you. Most people don't know any of this. Okay. They don't know what their numbers are. And because of that, there are lots of disease that affect men in this world that are avoidable if we're only keeping an eye on them a little bit earlier. This conversation is not for people that are in their 50s, 60s, 70s. This conversation is for those of you listening that are in your teens, 20s, 30s, 40s. Not that it's unimportant for people that are older, but they may already be dealing with some of these issues and we're trying to get that under control. But those of you that don't have any of this stuff popping up yet, you need to start looking at it, because it is amazing how many people think they are quote unquote healthy when in fact they have a couple of signs that things are going a bad road, and the earlier we can stop them, the better. Okay, so here's what we need to know. When it comes to metabolic syndrome, the 5 things that we look at are, do you have high blood pressure? Okay, which is greater than 130/85. And again, that's also one of those things that I tell people when it comes to measuring your blood pressure. A lot of people do it like midday after they've gotten back from something. I usually always advise that people take their blood pressure first thing in the morning, laying on their back, they're in bed, they're at their most relaxed. That's really what I want to see. And the way that I've also told clients to do it, and I've had the doctors that I work with encourage this, is you take 3 readings, throw the first one out, use the next 2. Okay, so we want to look at blood pressure. Okay, greater than 130/85, bad sign. The next one you need blood work for, high triglycerides. Anything greater than 150 milligrams per deciliter is too much. Again, that's something that you're going to have to get from blood work, but that is kind of that top end number. If you're getting north of 150, another tick box there. Low HDL. HDL is the quote unquote good cholesterol that most people hear about. In men, if you have less than 40 milligrams per deciliter, that's a problem. We need that number to be up. LDL is the number that we want to be lower, but HDL, we actually do need to be higher. So anything less than 40, that's a problem. Number 4, basically how heavy you are. So what they call it is central adiposity. But for men, it's basically if your waist circumference is greater than 40 inches, that's a tick box. Okay. Last but not least is elevated fasting glucose. Again, something you're going to get from blood work. If it's greater than 110 milligrams per deciliter, that's a problem. We're looking at, some kind of insulin resistance popping up in that case. Now, if you meet 3 of those 5 criteria, you technically have metabolic syndrome. And what I want to point out to you guys about that is you will notice that only one of those things is being overweight. It's the 4th on that 5-part list. So being obese is not a necessity for you to have metabolic syndrome. There are people, especially different cultures around the world, who may look quote unquote thin or fit, who in fact are not. Because even though they're not overweight, they may have elevated glucose, they may have high blood pressure, they may have low HDL. That is possible. And so understand that although obesity is something we look at and go, okay, that does cause a lot of problems. It's true. There's no doubt about it. However, there's like a third of people that have metabolic syndrome that are considered not overweight or obese. A third. It's a lot of people. I think nationwide, it's something in the realm of like 22 million people or 33 million people that are regular weight but have metabolic syndrome. So just because you guys listening to this might think you are fit or thin, it doesn't mean you are. And again, culture plays a role in that to a point. Asian cultures just tend not to be able to hold as much fat. And so that you see this kind of weird thing where they don't look overweight, but they can have other health markers that are dangerous. So here's what you guys need to understand even more than that. If you meet 3 of those criteria, you are part of like 120, basically a third of the US has metabolic syndrome. A third of the US meets 3 of those 5. Okay. And essentially, you could almost say the entire US has at least one of them. Ultimately, the goal that I want for all of my clients is that we have none of them. Certainly not 3. But our goal is ultimately that all of those are within the ranges that we are trying to get to. And so let's talk a little bit about how I do that with clients and how I would want you guys to handle that. Number 1, I am a pretty big advocate that blood work is done at least twice a year, depending on what we're finding in that blood work. A lot of men are getting it done once a year. They have their annual physical, and they say that is enough. That's what their doctor said they need to do, is come in once a year, get their blood work done. As long as it looks okay, we won't worry about it. I do not fall under that camp because a lot of things can happen in a year, first of all. But second of all, a lot of people are not getting full panels done. When their panels get done, I'll use the lipid screen or the lipid testing as the easy example. What they get is LDL, HDL in total, which are things that we need to know. But there's a lot of other, I'm going to use the word subcategories under there. For instance, the presence of LPA, which is something that I have. It's a fun little genetic gift I was given, which is not a very fun one. But if I didn't know about that, I might look at my numbers and go, my numbers are okay. Meanwhile, that little LPA number, if I don't know about it, can start to do some things that aren't very fun. It's like a supercharger for carrying LDL through my body. It's really not ideal. And so a couple of times a year, I want to make sure that I'm seeing all of those numbers, and I want full blood panels, not the basic panel, not most people, most men that I have come to work with, unless they work with one of the concierge doctor groups that I'm involved with, they're not getting a full blood panel. And so for all of you listening to this, it is vital that you get a full panel every single time. And I would advise you do it twice a year. A lot of people, a lot of men that I work with are nervous to do it because they're like, oh, what if something's there? Yeah, what if something is there that you can start preventing now? You can stop this in its tracks now, because it may be where there are certain things, LPA is a good example, where exercise and diet don't do a whole lot to it. That's kind of a problem. There may actually be some medication that you might need to be on that can help with that. So just make sure you guys understand that there are certain things that I'm not saying that you need to go and become some, drug addict when it comes to certain things to help with medical stuff. You don't need to be jumping on statins constantly or what have you, but there are certain drugs that may help you where exercise and diet alone just aren't really cutting it. But nonetheless, you still want to know what those numbers are so that you can track it across time. It's no different than when we exercise and we track our weights. I want to know, well, what did I do a year ago? And what did I do 2 weeks ago? And am I getting stronger? You want to know all of that information. Blood work is no different. Are we maintaining what we're looking at? Okay. So when it comes to triglycerides and your LDL and your glucose, that's kind of what I expect from people, is that twice a year they're getting a full panel of blood work. In addition to that, when it comes to glucose specifically, I am a huge advocate for the men that I work with wearing for 2 to 3 months a glucose monitor. So I have like a Freestyle Libre that I use. It seems to be the most common one, but there are a bunch of them now. But you just go to your doctor. You're like, hey, I'd like a glucose monitor. They order it for you. You go to the pharmacy, you pick it up, you stick it on the back of your arm. It doesn't hurt at all. You'll barely even notice it gets put on when you do it. And it will track what your glucose is doing during the day across time. I have found it to be one of the most profound ways for the men that I work with to curb their diets a little bit. Because what we'll do is we'll set that glucose monitor to, hey, if it breaks 140, 150, that's a problem. That tells me that you had too giant of a spike, essentially, of sugar in your system. We need to make sure that that's happening as little as is necessary. Essentially, the more hyperglycemic events we have, that big spike in glucose that we have, your arteries can essentially, I'm going to use the word expand, or thicken is probably the right word. And that makes you more susceptible to having problems. So what I've done with a lot of my men, what I've done with myself, we get them a glucose monitor. They're on it for typically 2 to 3 months. Some people it's just a month, but it just allows us to test kind of how they function. I know that pretty much all fruits that I eat generally, so blueberries, strawberries, and apples are the 3 main ones that I consume, don't really do a whole lot, if anything, to my glucose. However, if we go out and we do, chips and salsa at a restaurant, or if we do the bread that they bring out at the restaurant, especially like breads that you get just generically from the store, my glucose tends to spike pretty high. And so those are things that I'm just more conscious of. And almost always when I put people on a glucose monitor, they lose weight because they're just more conscious of what's happening. Their phone is letting them know like, hey, your glucose is going crazy right now. And then you just start to make some business decisions about, okay, is what I'm eating really worth it? I could really get into a long conversation about that, but I won't. That's really what you need to know there though. So your blood work, you want to be looking at your triglycerides, your LDL and your HDL, but certainly if that HDL is dropping too low, that's a problem. And we want to be looking at your resting glucose. If you're fasting, or your fasting glucose, if your fasting glucose is greater than 110, we've got a problem. Additionally, I really would recommend wearing a glucose monitor for, a couple of months. Not going to kill you. Now, let's get to blood pressure. When it comes to blood pressure, what I recommend to most men is to go on to Amazon, go buy, I think it's iHealth makes a battery-powered one, and you put it next to your bed. I want you to buy it, and for the next couple of weeks, every morning, take 3 readings. Even if it's just Monday through Friday, or even if it's Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Get a couple of days of the readings of your blood pressure, just to make sure that you're in the clear. If you are noticing after a couple of weeks that your blood pressure is constantly north of 120/80, you're not below that number, give your doctor a call and have a conversation, because that's something that we need to look at. High blood pressure is extremely common, but a lot of people are not seeing it. I even have borderline higher blood pressure than I should. I check it constantly. I stay on top of it. My diet is maintained, but I just have a little bit of a bump higher number. Whereas my wife she could go like run around and her blood pressure would still be low, which is great. Makes me happy. Keeps her healthy. But just understand that you should be measuring that consistently. Now, if you do a couple of weeks and you're like, hey, my blood pressure looks good, awesome. Give it a couple of months and then do it again. Make it a part of your life just to keep that blood pressure cuff by your bed, just to measure it. It's really not a hard thing. One of the things I hear from men too often is that it's too hard to do this stuff. It's too cumbersome. And my response to that is I try to keep it as friendly as I can. It takes no time to do any of those things. To measure your blood pressure in the morning a couple of days a week, it's going to take a grand total of 2 minutes to do all 3 of them. It goes right up, comes back down, measures it. You click the button again, you do it a couple of times and it's over. Just a couple of weeks of that. And then do it, quarterly. Blood work. There are people that'll come to your house now to do it. You don't even have to go to the doctor. Twice a year. That's absolutely nothing. And you're doing everything you need. Glucose monitor. All you got to do is stick the thing on. For $50, it's really not a bad gig. And your phone will tell you when something goes wrong. Again, not a hard thing. So, especially considering the pretty terrible repercussions of not keeping track of those things. We're losing men far too early in this world from heart attacks, strokes, Alzheimer's, various cancers. And much of that is avoidable, gentlemen. These modern diseases are very avoidable. They are earned diseases. Heart disease, for the most part, is earned. Type 2 diabetes, earned. Insulin problems are earned, unless you're a type 1 diabetic and you were born with it. So understand, overweight, earned. So understand that we can prevent all of these things so that you are alive and able to be a part of your children's and your wife and your family and your friends' lives. We talked about this yesterday. I was on my soapbox about it. Your health is worth more than just you having a good time and having fun. It is about the people around you who are going to be left without you if you don't start making some good decisions about your health. And they're not hard, fellas. This isn't rocket science. We're not reinventing the wheel. We just need to be conscious of a few things. And in doing that, you can stop a lot of suffering long term because you just nipped it in the butt when you needed to. So, understand. I know I've been long-winded today. Know your big 5. Elevated blood pressure, greater than 130/85, greater than 150 with your triglycerides total. Your HDL being less than 40. Your waist circumference being greater than 40. Okay. And lastly, your elevated fasting glucose or your fasting glucose being greater than 110. Those are the 5 things that we look at. You need to start tracking those. If you haven't had blood work done, go get a full panel of blood work done. I want you to ask them for all of the LPA, your full lipid panel, full hormone panel, everything. I want to know every single number. Homocysteine being another big one, some liver enzymes that we want to look at. Make sure that everything is on there. And then review that with your doctor. And make sure that you're not falling into one of the categories of those 5 signs of metabolic syndrome. Okay? If you have any other questions, let me know. Shoot me a message. I'm happy to help. Ultimately, my goal is that we have the healthiest group of men in the world who listen to podcasts like this. That's what I want, because that means that you are there for your family. You are there to love them. If freak things happen, hey, we can't control it, but you should be doing everything in your power to be as healthy and strong and vivacious, it's a fun word of the day, as you can. That's it, boys. I love you all. God bless. Be strong. Get after it today. Whew. All right. I'm out.